The Johansson family, consisting of Scott, Kate, and Alex, were taking a campus tour at Bucknell University. Alex planned to study there next year, but instead of listening to the directions from the guide, Scott and Kate were busy warning Alex to avoid promiscuity when he was studying there. A few months later, Alex graduated and registered himself at Bucknell, and soon an email from campus arrived and was opened together with her parent. She was accepted. As a celebration of her acceptance, Scott held a party at his house. He invited the neighbors and friends from college, one of whom was Frank, a man known to be addicted to adult movies and gambling. Alex's study in college surely would cost money, and Scott depended on the scholarship from the city government to pay the tuition. But at the city meeting that year, they were informed that the scholarship for high-achieving children would be stopped because the mayor, Bob, was going to build a public swimming pool. This construction required a large amount of funds, so some of the budget funds would be diverted to finance the construction of the pool, including the scholarship budget. Scott and Kate immediately voiced their objection because Alex was supposed to be the scholarship recipient this year. This objection made Bob hold a vote to see who voted for the scholarship to continue and who voted for the construction of a swimming pool. The result was that almost all residents voted for the construction of a swimming pool, so Scott and Kate had to swallow their disappointment. The problem was that they didn't have spare money to pay for the tuition. To cover Alex's college costs, both of them looked for various ways to get extra money. They went to the bank to apply for a loan, but the bank refused. Kate went to her old office and asked to be hired again, but the office couldn't just accept her after she resigned. Scott tried to ask his boss for a raise, which he couldn't grant just because he would send his daughter to college. They were about to give up after all their efforts failed when they remembered that they had an appointment to go to Las Vegas with Frank. They decided to go to Frank's house and intended to cancel the promise, but when they got there, they saw Frank arguing with Raina, his wife. Raina could no longer stand Frank, who was addicted to adult films and gambling, and the worst thing was that Frank couldn't give up his habit of gambling. Frank looked very messy because Raina asked him to divorce, making Scott back down his intention to cancel the trip, especially when Frank said that he had been waiting for the trip to calm his heart. In the end, the three of them still went to Vegas and visited the casino there. When they entered one of the casinos, Frank looked livelier and happier. He even invited Scott and Kate to bet in the game. At first, Scott and Kate didn't want to, but when Frank promised that they could pay for Alex's college if they won, Scott's interest was piqued. He bet several $100s for the number 4, even though Frank thought 4 was an unlucky number, but miraculously, Scott actually won. Moreover, the win wasn't just a one-off. Frank felt like Scott was in lucky mode at that time, so he asked Scott to jeep betting everything. The money that once was only a few dollars was raised to become enough to pay Alex's college tuition, but at that time, Scott wasn't satisfied yet and decided to bet all his money back on number 4. But this was where Scott's luck ran out because the last dice no longer gave the number 4, but the number 7. This made Scott lose all his money, including the money he once had. But even though he lost, Frank kept trying to cheer him up by saying that it was natural for the bookie to win in the end. Hearing this, Scott casually asked about what if he was the bookie. Surprisingly, Frank took it seriously, and after returning from Las Vegas, Frank presented his idea to get a lot of money in a short time, namely open their own casino. He even presented the gambling algorithm on how the bookie would always end up winning. Frank's presentation interested Scott but not Kate, considering that the risk was very big if caught, but Scott insisted on doing it because they didn't have any other to pay Alex's college tuition. In the end, for Alex's sake, Kate agreed to the idea. Frank immediately turned his house into a casino since there were a lot of empty rooms because his wife left carrying most of the things in the house. The fence of the house was also very high and soundproof, so it was difficult to be seen from outside if they were running a casino in the house. Apart from that, there was a secret entrance that had been prepared. Later, the players' cars would be parked at the supermarket behind Frank's house. While Frank prepared his house, Scott and Kate were tasked with looking for the players. They both met each of their friends or neighbors who had a lot of money and were busy with work. Scott was very sure they would be interested in gambling as an outlet for stress because they were too busy working. After several players were gathered, they were directed by Scott to enter through the supermarket, then out the back door, and ended up in Frank's backyard. They didn't expect Frank to turn his house into a casino with lots of machines that they could try. The game started and everyone enjoyed their time while Frank, Scott, and Kate monitored and occasionally provided the facilities needed by the players. Every day, Frank added new machines and new people started to come. Apart from providing a bar to relax, Frank also provided an entertainment venue in the form of stand-up comedy. The casino ran smoothly in the first week. However, there was one problem. They ended up losing $3,500 because many visitors actually won at their table. Scott and Kate started to get nervous, especially when they got the details of tuition fees reaching $50,000. Entering the second week, Frank installed 5 safes, each of which can hold $100,000. If the safe was full, they would get $500,000, which would then be divided equally. New visitors kept coming, but the large number of visitors also created new problems. One day, players named Reggie and Garvey got into a fight because one of them lost a bet. They got involved in a fight, so Scott had to stop them, but Frank instead facilitated them in a boxing ring and invited the other players to place bets. Unexpectedly, their fight ended quickly when Garvey was immediately KO'd in just one hit. This made a visitor named Martha dissatisfied because she bet on Garvey's win. Her complaint was followed by a player named Laura. They continued fighting in the ring, replacing Reggie, which had won by a landslide. This time, the game was much more exciting because Martha and Laura were equally strong. Both of them fought until they were bloody, and no one seemed superior. In the end, both were knocked out at the same time, and because there was no winner, all the betting money belonged to the bookie and added a great income for the casino. Frank decided to expand the business by adding a swimming pool area and a massage place to make visitors feel at home and spend more time at the casino. At the weekly meeting at the city hall, many residents were absent for no apparent reason. Laura was one of those present, but she came with a battered face. Bob asked her about the reason behind her battered face, but Laura, who was still annoyed about last night's defeat, instead interpreted Bob's question as a challenge. After the meeting was finished, Bob called an officer named Chandler and asked him to find out what was going on in the city. After several days of watching the neighborhood, Chandler found that there was a supermarket whose parking lot was always full every night. He monitored the condition of the supermarket and saw a suspicious visitor whom he then followed to the back of the supermarket. He didn't immediately confront him and came back the next morning. The next morning in the forest, he met Frank, who was seen putting something in his pocket. Chandler was suspicious and asked, but Frank swiftly took his cell phone and accused Chandler of entering his property without permission. Apart from almost being caught by the police, they also faced a problem, namely that a cheater. Frank found him via CCTV, and he intended to confront the player to stop cheating. At first, they only reminded him through words, but because they looked amateur at handling the problem, the person just laughed them off. He felt brave because he was Tommy's subordinate, a cruel loan shark in town. Scott took an axe to scare him, and that was when the mistake happened. He accidentally chopped off the man's finger. The next day, Scott was haunted by feelings of guilt because he had cut someone's finger. He kept hallucinating seeing a finger or seeing someone cutting off their finger. He immediately hid at Frank's house and told Frank his problem, which Frank reassured him that was all just hallucinations, and most importantly, people were afraid of him. It was true because since that incident, everyone no longer dared to go into debt without paying. They were afraid of having their fingers cut off if they were late or didn't pay the debt. The proceeds from collecting the debt were quite large. They decided to use some of it to have dinner at a luxury restaurant, but when they were enjoying their food, Frank saw Raina, his ex-wife, who came with another man. Frank approached him intending to beat him, but unfortunately, the man was stronger than him and easily pinned him down. Chandler was called by the restaurant and reminded Frank not to make commotions. Not long after, Bob came with his secretary, and they were suspicious of the unusual appearance of Scott and his wife. The next night, Bob and Chandler went to Frank's house. Chandler was very sure that the parking lot, which was always full at the supermarket, must have something to do with Frank's house, so he invited Bob to come with him to investigate. When Chandler entered, he was immediately shocked when he saw that Frank's house was a fully-fledged casino, where there were lots of slot machines and gamblers. When they found out the police were coming, everyone immediately ran out, and all that was left was Scott, Frank, and Kate. Every corner of the room was searched by Bob and Chandler, until finally, they entered Frank's room where the safes were kept. Bob found all the money and immediately confiscated it, saying it was for city development purposes. This incident was a blow to Scott and Kate, who had been working hard to raise money for Alex's college fees. Scott intended to stop everything because the world of gambling was not for them, but Kate didn't want to give up yet. She intended to call all the customers and tell them that the casino was still in the business. This succeeded in inviting customers back to spend their money at the casino, but just as they restarted the casino, they got unexpected guests, namely Alex and Tommy. Alex came to the casino because he was invited by her friends and was surprised to find her parents were the ones who ran the casino. Meanwhile, Tommy came because he wanted revenge for his subordinate's cut finger. He was looking for the one who cut the finger and wanted to ask him to pay compensation. Tommy searched the entire casino until he met Frank, who directed him to Scott and Kate. Tommy immediately saw the safes and asked for compensation for his subordinate's fingers with the money there. Kate tried to explain that they had just been robbed, so there was no more money to give, but this made Tommy annoyed, and he immediately took Alex as collateral so that Scott would pay anyway. He handcuffed his hand with Alex's so she couldn't run away. Tommy didn't realize it when Scott was suddenly behind him with an axe in his hand. Through his wife's help, he had the opportunity to cut off the handcuffs that were binding Tommy and Alex's hands, But instead of breaking the handcuff, he accidentally missed it and cut Tommy's arm. Tommy screamed hysterically while holding his amputated arm. It didn't stop there. Kate came with a flamethrower and tried to scare Tommy, only to end up burning his other hand. She panicked and asked someone to put out the fire. Scott went to get water in a glass and poured it without knowing that the water was vodka. Tommy's men also tried to put out the fire with a water gun, but it turned out that it was also filled with vodka. Frank tried to put out the fire by rolling Tommy on his casino carpet. Unfortunately, the fire spread and burned the whole house and all its contents. Frank's house burned down, causing all the money from the casino to also be burned. Scott and Kate once again failed to send Alex to college. This time, they were honest with Alex about the possibility that she would not be able to go to campus. They also said that Bob had taken the money they intended to use to pay for the tuition. Alex was very upset to hear Bob's name, who made all this tragedy happen, so she thought she would take back the money that had been collected by her parents. At first, Scott and Kate thought they wouldn't be able to get their money back, but suddenly Chandler offered help to them to take their money back. It turned out that Chandler was fed up with Bob because Bob never really cared about the city. Recently, he found out that Bob and his secretary were having an affair, and Bob used the city funds to finance his affair. When Scott heard that all the money he made was used by Bob for useless things, he was so triggered and, together with Kate, decided to take matters into their hands. They worked together with Chandler to lure Bob out of his office by showing a video containing the people mocking him at the casino. Bob was offended and intended to raid the casino with Chandler. After leaving the office, the Johansson family entered the office and opened Bob's safe to take all the money. Luckily, Bob still put all the money in the suitcase, so they had no problem taking it away. Unfortunately, Bob's secretary saw them came out of his office and immediately reported it to Bob. Bob returned and still had time to intercept them, who almost managed to escape. They ran to avoid Bob. They slipped, but Bob managed to get up first and grab the suitcase. When Bob entered the meeting room, Scott jump-kicked Bob so he couldn't escape anymore. He intended to take his suitcase back, but Bob had already handcuffed his hands with the suitcase. Scott immediately took an axe and swung at the handcuffs. This time, he managed to hit the handcuffs without cutting Bob's hands. Right after that, Chandler came and Bob ordered him to arrest the Johansson family, but of course, Chandler refused. Bob's secretary showed up and Bob hoped her to be on his side. Unfortunately, the secretary also turned away from him because she wanted to be loyal to her husband. Bob was left alone and angry because he had given everything he had to her. He even admitted that he had used the city budget for his affair. Scott then said that Bob's words had been recorded on camera, so Bob immediately ran away from there. Finally, Scott could take the money home in peace. The money was immediately used to pay off Alex's tuition fees from Bucknell University so that Alex could study in college.